She was a virgin and terrified, until the cowboy gave her a blanket, and his daughter gave her painting together. She stumbled down the dirt road with dust clinging to her shoes in the late summer wind, carrying the weight of her fear. She had run from everything she knew, from the heavy silence of a house that had never felt like home, from voices that demanded she be something she wasn't ready to be. She was a virgin, untouched not just in body but in spirit, raw and trembling, a girl whose soul had not yet known the softness of safety. The night pressed against her chest like a closing hand. Her legs were weary, her throat dry, but her heart refused to stop its frantic beating, as though it knew there was something waiting beyond the darkness. A faint glow appeared ahead, a ranch house lantern swaying against the horizon, its light flickering with promise. She hesitated, the terror of being seen fighting against the need for warmth. She didn't know whose land she had crossed onto, nor whether mercy lived there. Yet her body pushed her forward, until she collapsed just short of the porch steps. The door creaked open, and the tall frame of a cowboy emerged, his shadow bending over her. He did not speak at first. He simply studied the girl with eyes weathered by storms and seasons, then without a word, laid a blanket across her trembling shoulders. It smelled faintly of hay and smoke, of nights spent under stars. She clutched it as though it were the first shield she had ever been given, the fabric soaking up her fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, more mountain than man. "You're safe here." The words were foreign, almost painful in their kindness. She wanted to believe them but could not yet trust herself to. He guided her inside where the light was softer, his boots heavy against the wooden floor, each step measured so as not to startle her. And then, from behind him, came the quick sound of smaller feet. A little girl, hair loose and eyes wide, peeked around his leg with the unguarded innocence of childhood. She stared at the stranger wrapped in her father's blanket, then broke into a smile that felt like sunrise. Without hesitation, the child crossed the room and placed something small into the girl's hand, a ragged doll, its seams worn, its dress faded. It was the simplest gift, yet it carried something far larger than its size. The girl felt her chest swell with an unfamiliar ache, a mixture of longing and relief. The child had given her more than a toy. She had offered trust, belonging, a piece of a world that did not demand or wound. Tears she had buried deep rose against her will, slipping silently down her cheeks. The cowboy said nothing, only rested his hand lightly on his daughter's head, letting the child's offering speak louder than any reassurance could. The blanket on her shoulders was warmth, the doll in her palm was welcome, and between them, a heart that had known nothing but fear began, tentatively, to believe it might finally be allowed to rest. She had not meant to collapse. Her legs had carried her farther than she believed possible, but they had also betrayed her at last, leaving her crumpled in the dust. Her chest heaved as though the air itself had turned into fire, and her vision swam with shadows. The night was alive with crickets, the wind restless in the grass, the moon swollen and watchful above. She thought for a moment she would die there, her body folded in on itself like a secret no one cared to find. But then the light appeared, a single lantern swaying from the porch of a house that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. Its timbers were worn, its roof slanted under years of weather, yet to her eyes it glowed like a beacon. She wanted to turn away, to keep her suffering private, but something deep inside her tugged, perhaps the same small voice that had urged her to run. In the first place, she pulled herself forward, crawling at first, then staggering until her hand brushed against the wooden step. The door creaked open before she could even muster the courage to knock. A man stood in its frame, tall and broad, his silhouette outlined by the lamp behind him. A cowboy, she thought instantly, though that word seemed too simple for the gravity he carried. His hat shadowed his face, but his stillness spoke louder than any greeting. For a moment, she froze, her fear prickling, every instinct screaming to retreat. He stepped forward slowly, not with menace but with a strange patience, as though he had seen fear like hers before and knew it well enough not to startle it. In his hands, he carried a blanket, folded neatly. He knelt before her without asking who she was or why she was there, and draped the blanket over her shoulders. Its weight settled around her like a vow. She clutched it with desperate fingers, feeling the rough wool scratch against her skin, breathing in its scent of hay, dust, and firewood. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low, steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. Safe. The word scraped against her heart. She had never truly known safety. Her life had been a chain of obligations, expectations, and whispered commands she dared not refuse. She had lived in silence, in watchfulness, waiting for the next demand, the next threat, the next moment her innocence would be taken by force or by pressure. That word, safe, was foreign, unearned, and yet something in his tone made her want to believe it, if only for this single night. He guided her inside, his steps measured so she would not flinch at them. The house smelled of wood smoke and bread, the air warmer than the cool night she had escaped. She hesitated at the threshold, but the pull of exhaustion was stronger than her suspicion, and she let herself be led past the doorway into a room lit with soft golden light. Then she heard the light shuffle of smaller feet. From behind the man's leg peeked a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw and eyes as clear as the morning sky. The girl's gaze landed instantly on the stranger wrapped in her father's blanket. For a moment, the child tilted her head as though puzzling out what manner of creature had arrived at their door. Then, with a suddenness that stole the breath from the weary traveler, the child smiled. It was not the cautious smile of politeness, nor the wary smile of suspicion. It was wide, unguarded, a pure beam of welcome. Before her father could say a word, the little girl darted forward and pressed something into the stranger's hand. It was a doll, worn, its seams pulling in places, its dress faded to a color that had long forgotten its name. But it was clearly beloved, its yarn hair frayed from countless nights held against a dreaming cheek. The girl stared down at the toy in disbelief. No one had ever given her something like this, something not demanded, not bartered, not withheld as punishment. The child's eyes shone as though she were sharing a secret, and her small fingers lingered for a heartbeat on the stranger's hand before pulling away. The girl's throat tightened. She had thought herself emptied of tears, but they rose again, slow and unstoppable, slipping down her cheeks in silence. She wanted to speak, to say thank you, to tell them she didn't deserve this kindness, but the words clung stubbornly in her chest. The cowboy said nothing, watching with a quiet understanding that spoke of patience carved by years of solitude and labor. He placed a hand on his daughter's head, and the child leaned into it, her smile never fading. The blanket on her shoulders was warmth. The doll in her palm was trust. Between the two, a heart that had only known fear began to sense, though faintly, though hesitantly, that maybe it was allowed to stop running. The night passed in fragments. She sat by the fire, the blanket pulled close, while the cowboy brewed coffee and set bread and cheese on the table. He didn't ask questions, and she didn't volunteer answers. The little girl hummed softly to herself, arranging cups with the seriousness of a hostess, stealing glances at their guest as though she were some fairy tale wanderer who had appeared at their door. When exhaustion pulled her eyelids down, the cowboy nodded toward a narrow bed in the corner room. She hesitated, every instinct telling her not to trust such a vulnerable space. Yet the child followed her in, set the doll on the pillow, and said, "She'll keep you company." The words were so innocent, so final, that resistance seemed impossible. The stranger lay down, her body trembling from both relief and fear, clutching the doll as though it were a shield. She listened as the house settled around her. The creak of wood, the murmur of wind against the shutters, the faint sound of the cowboy moving about in the other room. She thought she would lie awake, haunted by the steps of her past. But the warmth of the blanket and the presence of the doll pressed against her chest worked some quiet alchemy, and her body gave in. For the first time in her memory, she slept without fear of waking to harm. When dawn came, the light streaming through the window was pale and unassuming. She stirred, half believing the night had been a dream, but the doll was still in her hand, and the blanket was still tucked around her. For a moment, she let herself breathe in the air of that small room, unhurried, unfreighted. It felt like sacrilege to rise, but she pushed herself from the bed and padded softly into the main room. The cowboy was already awake, seated at the table, his hat set aside, his face revealed. It was lined, sun-worn, carved with both hardship and strength. He looked up as she entered but did not rise, did not crowd her. "There's food," he said simply, nodding toward the loaf of bread, the jar of honey, the jug of milk. She sat across from him, tentative, folding her hands in her lap before daring to reach for anything. The child appeared moments later, bright-eyed despite the early hour, climbing onto her chair with the confidence of someone who had never doubted she belonged. She began talking. About the horses, about the rooster who crowed too early, about a patch of wildflowers down by the stream. The words tumbled from her like stones rolling downhill, unstoppable. The stranger listened, half in awe. She had never heard such free speech, unburdened by caution. Every word was a revelation. Every laugh from the child was a sound she wanted to gather in her hands and protect. The cowboy let his daughter chatter, his eyes occasionally flicking to their guest, measuring her silence not with judgment but with patience. When she finally broke it, her voice was hoarse. "Why?" she asked softly, unable to form more. He knew what she meant. His eyes settled on her, calm, steady. "Because you needed it," he answered. The words struck her with a force stronger than any demand she had ever endured. Because you needed it, not because she earned it, not because it was owed, but because her need was enough. Her hands shook where they lay in her lap, and once more tears welled. She pressed her face against the blanket draped still over her shoulders, hiding from their eyes, but inside her something began to shift. A seed planted, fragile, but alive. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like pages turning in a book she had never thought she'd be allowed to read. Each morning, the ranch awoke with the first blush of light, and she would find herself drawn to the sounds of animals stirring, the creak of leather, the cowboy's boots moving across the boards. He never rushed her, never asked her name again after the first night. She was a presence in his home, unexpected yet not unwelcome, and somehow he seemed to understand that pressing her would break something delicate she was still clutching inside. The child, Lydia, as she finally learned, took to her immediately. It was Lydia who first dared to tug her hand and pull her into the wide yard beyond the porch. The girl chattered endlessly about the horses, the chickens, the wild rabbits she swore lived under the barn. At first, the stranger followed in silence, her eyes darting at every sound, as though the past might come galloping across the horizon to seize her again. But Lydia's laughter was persistent, washing over her like waves against stone, wearing down her fear grain by grain. One afternoon, Lydia dragged her to the corral where a mare stood, calm and watchful. "She's Daisy," the child announced proudly. "Papa says she's gentle, but she doesn't let just anyone near her." The stranger hesitated at the fence, her fingers curling into the rough wood. Horses had always been something she saw from afar, their size intimidating, their power a reminder of how small and vulnerable she felt. "Go on," the cowboy's voice rumbled from behind. She turned to find him leaning against the post, his arms folded. "Daisy's got a good heart. She'll know yours." She almost laughed at the absurdity. Her heart, bruised and battered, felt like the last thing an innocent creature should be exposed to. But Lydia's hand was already reaching through the fence, offering a palmful of oats. "Here," the girl urged, "she likes it when you're gentle." Trembling, the stranger extended her hand. Daisy lowered her great head, her breath warm against skin that had known only cold commands and harsh touches. The mare's lips brushed her palm, soft and certain, and for a moment, something inside her cracked open. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, tears stinging her eyes once more. Daisy nudged her hand, asking for more, and the girl laughed, a sound so startled and genuine it made both Lydia and her father glance at her with quiet wonder. From then on, she found herself drawn to the corral, to the slow rhythm of brushing Daisy's coat, to the way the animal accepted her without question. Trust was something she thought had been stolen from her, yet here was this creature giving it freely. And through Daisy, she began to look at the cowboy differently too. He was a man of few words, but every act, whether fixing a fence, cooking beans over the stove, or carrying Lydia on his shoulders, spoke of steadiness. He was not like the men she had run from, men who sought control, who measured a girl's worth by obedience. He moved with quiet certainty, his strength never sharpened into cruelty. Still, the past clung. At night, she woke in sweat, clutching the doll Lydia had given her as though it were her only tether. Shadows pressed against her, memories whispered. Sometimes she slipped from bed to sit by the window, watching the moon trace its silver path. On one such night, the cowboy found her there. He didn't approach immediately, only leaned against the doorway, waiting until she acknowledged him with a startled glance. "Bad dreams," he said softly, not as a question but as recognition. She nodded, unable to form words. He crossed the room and sat on the opposite chair, leaving space between them. "They fade," he murmured. "Not quick, not easy, but they do." Something in his tone carried the weight of his own history, though she didn't dare ask. Instead, she whispered, "What if they don't?" He looked at her steadily. "Then you learn to carry them. But you don't carry them alone." The words sank into her like rain into dry earth. She turned her gaze back to the window, but her hand loosened its death grip on the doll, resting instead on the blanket he had given her that first night. For the first time, she wondered if he meant for her to stay. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to remember what living felt like. Weeks slid into each other. The stranger began to help in small ways, gathering eggs, chopping vegetables, sweeping the floor. At first she did it out of guilt, but gradually, it became something else. A rhythm, a contribution, a way of belonging. Lydia beamed whenever she joined in, as though proud to share her world with the guest. And the cowboy said nothing, only nodded in quiet approval, his eyes softening in those rare moments when their gazes met. But the past was not gone. It lingered like a shadow on the edge of the sun. One evening, as she carried water from the well, she heard hoofbeats in the distance, too sharp, too many. Fear gripped her throat. She froze, water spilling down her arms, until the sound faded away. When she returned to the house, her face pale, the cowboy's eyes flicked to her, reading the terror she could not hide. He said nothing then, but later, after Lydia was asleep, he sat across from her by the fire. "You running from someone?" he asked quietly. Her breath caught. She had avoided the question, even from herself, but now it pressed too close. She nodded. He studied her for a long moment, then said, "Doesn't matter who. What matters is you're here now. And here, they won't touch you." The promise in his voice was iron. She felt it settle deep inside her, fighting against the disbelief that had been stitched into her bones. For the first time, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, her flight had not ended in another trap, but in a kind of sanctuary. The season turned. The air grew cooler, the mornings sharp with frost. She found herself laughing more, not just small startled bursts but real laughter that filled her chest. Lydia insisted they bake together, though the kitchen turned into chaos and flour dusted them both. The cowboy walked in to find them shrieking with laughter over a loaf that had collapsed entirely, and though his face remained mostly stern, his eyes glimmered with something softer than amusement. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Lydia climbed into her lap with the doll and whispered, "You feel like Mama." The words pierced her, both wound and balm. She didn't know what had happened to the child's mother, but she saw the flash of grief in the cowboy's eyes when Lydia said it. She held the child close, her own throat aching, realizing that for the first time in her life, someone wanted her there not for what she could give or endure, but simply for who she was. The final test came one night when riders did arrive. 3 men, rough-voiced, demanding, their presence sharp as knives in the dark. She recognized one of them instantly, his voice dragging old terror to the surface. Her hands shook violently as she pressed Lydia against her side, ready to run, ready to shatter. But the cowboy stepped forward, unflinching. "She's not yours," he said, his voice steady as stone. The men sneered, one reaching for his holster. But the cowboy's hand was quicker, iron flashing in the lantern light. He did not shoot. Not yet, but the message was carved into the night. "She stays. You go." Silence stretched, heavy and thick. Then, muttering curses, the men retreated into the dark, their hoofbeats fading. The stranger collapsed, her knees buckling, tears flooding her face. She had expected him to hand her over, to weigh the danger against her presence. Instead, he had stood like a wall, unmovable. Later, when the child was asleep, she turned to him, her voice raw. "Why risk it? You don't even know me." He met her gaze with that same quiet steadiness. "Don't need to. I know enough. You're someone who deserved better. And now you have it." The dam inside her broke. She wept in his arms, not the trembling, fearful tears of before, but the deep, racking sobs of release. He held her as though he understood that tears could be a kind of healing, saying nothing, letting the silence cradle them both. From that night forward, something shifted. The nightmares came less often. The sound of horses no longer sent her fleeing. She began to move through the house with a sense of belonging that startled her. Lydia clung to her constantly, and the cowboy, though quiet as always, let his gaze rest on her with a warmth that no words could capture. Months passed. The seasons deepened, snow covering the land in white. The stranger, no longer truly a stranger, sat by the fire one night, the doll resting in her lap, the blanket draped across her shoulders. Lydia slept nearby, curled under quilts, her breath soft. The cowboy sat across from her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Stay," he said simply. Her breath caught. The word was both question and answer, both invitation and promise. She looked at the child, at the doll that had been her first gift, at the blanket that had been her first shield. She looked at him, steady and sure, and for the first time, she did not feel afraid to answer. "I will," she whispered. And in that moment, the girl who had once been a virgin and terrified, who had run until her body broke, felt herself reborn, not into someone's possession, but into belonging. The cowboy had given her a blanket, a shelter for her trembling body. His daughter had given her a doll, a key to trust and tenderness. Together, they had given her what she thought impossible, a home.